האם זה באמת סגולה בדוקה? הסגולה ללמוד בזה?
Erev Tov and good evening, everyone. We're in the Zera Shimshon on Parsha Nitzavim. We're doing Os Gimel, section number 3. Before we start, we're just going to take a look at a pasuk. This is in the Parsha Nitzavim, Perek Lamed, pasuk Yud Aleph. It's actually a well-known pasuk. It says, Ki ha-mitzvah hazos, because this mitzvah, Asher anochi mitzavcha hayom, that I command you today, lo nifleis hi mimcha, it is not hidden from you, velo rechoka hi, and it is not far away. So the Zera Shimshon is going to start with a Medrash Rabbah that quotes that pasuk, and let's get right in. Medrash Rabbah. The Medrash Rabbah says, Ki ha-mitzvah hazos, it quotes the pasuk that we just read, v'chulei, ki ha-mitzvah hazos v'chulei, Rabbonin Amrei, the Chazal said, Im beirachta es ha-Torah, if you make a bracha, if you say birchas ha-Torah, if you make a bracha on Torah study, la'atzmecha at mevarech, for yourself you are making a bracha. So that's a little bit of a cryptic statement, but let's continue. Shenemar ki vi yirbu yamecha. As the pasuk, this is a pasuk in Mishlei, as the pasuk in Mishlei says in reference to the Torah, ki vi yirbu yamecha, through me, meaning through the Torah, your days will be multiplied. So the Medrash Rabbah, and there's a little more to go, but so far it is saying that the Rabbanan said when you make a bracha on the Torah, on Torah study, you're actually blessing yourself. You're making a bracha that it's good for you. Why? Because when you study Torah, the pasuk in Mishlei tells us that being involved in Torah, being osek in Torah, lengthens a person's days. Then the Medrash continues, V'shema tomru, and perhaps you will say, Lidra'aschem nasati lochem es haTorah, that it was bad for the Jewish people to receive the Torah. Lo nasati elo letovaschem. But that's not true, because I only gave you the Torah. I gave it specifically and solely for your benefit. There's nothing bad in receiving the Torah. It's all for the good of Bnei Yisrael. Shahare malache hashares nisabullah, because the malache hashares desired it. The malache hashares wanted to receive it. So of course it must have been something of tremendous spiritual power that the malache hashares wanted it. V'ne'el lama mehem, and it was hidden from them. V'ne'el ma mehem, and it was hidden from them. Shenemar, and there the mevachulei, and there the Medrash Rabbah ends off with a pasuk from Eov, which says that the Torah was hidden, or which we learn to mean, we interpret to mean that the Torah was hidden from the Malachi Ashares ad kan Lashono, until here is a quote from the Medrash Rabbah. So this Medrash Rabbah, before we even get to the Zera Shimshon's question, let's just understand it on the simplest, most basic level. It quotes the pasuk from our Parsha Nitzavim, in which it says the Torah is not hidden from us. And then the Medrash Rabbah brings in the idea that the Torah was hidden from the Malachi Ashares, meaning that they wanted it, they desired it, they wanted to get it for themselves, but Hashem hid it from them, did not allow them to do that. And so you see what a special gift it was that Hashem prevented the Malachi Ashares from having it, and gave it only to Bnei Yisrael, to Klal Yisrael. Let's continue in the Zera Shimshon. He asks a question. Tema, this is hard to understand. Dehechi tisak adatin, because how would anyone ever think, lomar, to say, shenosan lanu haTorah lera'asenu, that Hashem gave us the Torah for our to be bad to us, to have a negative impact on us. V'halo b'chol ha-mitzvos sheba, and behold, all of the mitzvos that are in the Torah, anu notlin aleihen schar. We take schar, we receive a schar, we receive reward for doing all of the mitzvos in the Torah. So obviously it's to our benefit. We're rewarded for doing it. We receive incredible rewards. And as we know, Chazal say that one moment in Olam Haba is enjoying Olam Haba is greater than all of the pleasure in this world put together. So the Zera Shimshon says, how did the Medrash Rabbah say that in case you might think Hashem gave us the Torah and that would be a bad thing for us? What does that mean? How could we ever think that when it's obvious that doing the mitzvahs in the Torah that we receive from Hashem is so much to our benefit because of the schar, because of the spiritual reward that we receive? So that's his question. V'yesh lomar she'isa b'mitzia perek zayin. It states in Gemara Bava Mitzia in the 7th perek, Alma of the haaretz. The Gemara brings in a pasuk from Yirmiyahu, in which the pasuk says, on what was the land lost, meaning on what was the Beis Hamikdash lost. So davar zeh nishal lachachamim. This thing was asked to the chachamim, v'chulei, etc. Vayom, and then the Gemara quotes the next pasuk. Vayomer Hashem al ozum es torasi. Hashem said, how did they lose the Beis Hamikdash? How did that happen? Because they forsook my Torah. What does it mean that they forsook my Torah? Amar Rav Yehuda Amar Rav. Rav Yehuda said that Rav said, Shelo birchu baTorah techila. They did not make a bracha on Torah beforehand. In the beginning, before studying Torah, they didn't recite the Birchas HaTorah. And that's what it means that they forsook my Torah. And that ultimately led to the destruction of the Beis HaMikdash. Upirshu HaMeforshim, and the commentators explained the kivon de lo birchu. Since the people at that time were not careful about saying Birchas HaTorah, gilu dataihu, this revealed their frame of mind. The lav mishum chashivusa v'hanaasa nisaskuba. That it was not because of the Torah's importance and its spiritual benefit that they studied it. That was not their motivation. Ella shelo lishma, but rather they studied the Torah not for lishma reasons, not for the reasons of intrinsic reasons to the Torah itself, which the Zera Shimshon just said means because of its intrinsic importance and significance, and because of the great spiritual pleasure and benefit that a person gets when he studies Torah. But rather, instead of those reasons, they studied the Torah shelo lishma. For example, an example that's brought in the Meforshim is, imagine that a person studies Torah in order to become wise enough to criticize others, knowledgeable enough to criticize others, or in order to contradict someone else who explained a certain section of the Torah a certain way, and the person is motivated to say, oh, let me study even more so I can go back and contradict that person and show them that they don't really know the full picture. They don't really know the full story. So that's shelo lishma. These are not the kinds of motivations that a person should have. Shekol ha'osa davar, anyone who does something, v'nehenebo, and he gets a benefit from it, mevorech al hana'aso. In general, we know that there is a bracha that one makes before benefiting for all kinds of things in this world. As the Gemara in Masechta Brachos says in that perek, al chaye sho'a mivarech. We make brachos before we eat food, which gives us life in this world, but that's only a temporary life. That's chaye sho'a. Al chaye ha'olam haba alachas kama v'kama. So if we do something like studying Torah, which brings us the merit to attain olam haba, then how much more so should we make a bracha before we study Torah? That's the Gemara over there in Masechta Brachos is discussing whether or not the halacha that we should recite blessings before studying Torah is a Torah law or a rabbinic law. And so the Gemara says, Kal v'chomer, if we make a bracha before consuming food, then how much more so is it obvious that we should make a bracha before studying Torah? V'hoil shelo nisasku ba lishma. And since at the time of the Chorban Beis Hamikdash, they did not involve themselves in Torah study for the proper intrinsic motivations, mishum hachi lo hayasa yechola lehatzilam. Therefore, their Torah study was not able to save them, mehayetzer hara, from the evil inclination, kefi segulasa, according to its chosen specialness, demagna, that it protects, umatzla, and it saves someone, it saves people, it protects people and saves people from the yetzer hara and from being tempted to violate the laws of the Torah. So, as the Zera Shimshon is accustomed to doing, he's providing building blocks before he puts them together to answer his question. So here, from the Gemara in Bava Metzia, Perek Zayin, and the other Gemaras that he quotes, we see the idea that there are two types of Torah study: studying Torah lishma, for its own sake, because of its intrinsic value and the spiritual benefit that comes with the study of Torah, brings not only that spiritual benefit, but it brings protection from the yetzer hara, which helps protect the person from violating the Torah, from doing averos. On the other hand, if a person studies Torah shelo lishma, not for intrinsic reasons, but for the kinds of reasons that we mentioned before that are not appropriate reasons to study Torah, appropriate motivations to study Torah, then it does not, that Torah study does not protect a person from the yetzer hara. And if a person is not protected from the yetzer hara, then they are vulnerable to commit all kinds of averos and violate the Torah in all kinds of different ways. And ultimately, that's what led to the Chorban Habayis. That's what led to the destruction of the Beis Hamikdash. Now let's continue. Uba Perek Zayin de Yoma, in the 7th parak of Meseches Yoma, Amrinon, we say, Zacha, if a person merits it, and what that means according to the Meforshim is if a person merits to study Torah lishma, nasis lo sam chayim, then the Torah becomes for him a medicine of life, or a life-giving potion. It strengthens the person's life, and it brings health to that person. Lo zacha, however, if a person, God forbid, does not merit to study Torah for the right reasons, lishma, nasis lo samisa, then for that person it's like a deadly poison. Zacha, and the Gemara continues, if the person merits sorafto l'chaim, then the Torah purifies him. His study of Torah purifies him for a good life. Lo zacha, if he does not merit he doesn't study the Torah correctly and appropriately, sorafto l'misa, then it's purifying him and preparing him for misa, for death. So again, we see this idea of two different types of Torah study: the appropriate kind that is life-giving and has a profoundly positive impact, and the negative kind, so to speak, or the study of Torah for the wrong reasons and the wrong motivations that can actually be highly detrimental and is even called by the Gemara a sam misa, a deadly poison. The Od Amrinan beperik Chestekama, and we also say in the 8th parak of Meseches Baba Kama, Godol hamitzuva ve'oseh, that person who is commanded to do a mitzvah and does it is greater mimi she'eno mitzuva ve'oseh, than someone else who is not commanded to do a mitzvah and performs that mitzvah. This is a famous discussion in different places in the Gemara, and the Zera Shimshon is here quoting what we actually hold, the conclusion of those different discussions, which is that a person who is commanded to do a mitzvah and follows through and does that mitzvah receives a greater reward and that's considered a greater accomplishment than someone who has no commandment to follow a certain law but goes and does it anyway. And the reason for this is shekeshe'eno mitzuveh, when a person is not commanded to do a mitzvah, she'ein lo onesh, then that person will receive no punishment for not doing it. There's nothing at stake, so to speak, right? A person, it's totally up to their own discretion. They're not commanded to do the mitzvah. So whether the person does the mitzvah or doesn't do the mitzvah, it's their discretion. And if they choose not to do it, then they're not going to be punished for that, because they had no obligation. Ein Yetzer Hara misgare bo lehachshilo. And therefore, the Yetzer Hara does not try to harass this person to make him stumble. The Yetzer Hara only goes after, or only is attempting to prevent people from doing mitzvos when they are commanded to do those mitzvos. If a person is not commanded to do a mitzvah, let's imagine, for example, a person is not a Kohen and he wants to do a certain mitzvah that only a Kohen is commanded to do, or he wants to do something that at a time when it's not the time of that mitzvah, there's no commandment for him to do the mitzvah, and he wants to do it, even though it doesn't apply to him. So in those cases, the Yetzer Hara, there's no effort by the Yetzer Hara to prevent him from doing that mitzvah because he has no command to do that mitzvah. Ubeperakama di Kiddushin, and another Gemara states in the first parak of Maseches Kiddushin, Bonai, Hashem is quoted as saying, Bonai, my children, Borasi Yetzer Hara, I created the Yetzer Hara, Borasi lo Torah Tavlin, and I created the Torah to be a antidote to the Yetzer Hara. So it was, Hashem says, I know that the Yetzer Hara is very powerful. I'm the one who created the Yetzer Hara, and it is extremely powerful, and it's very hard for any human being to withstand the pressure and the persuasiveness of the Yetzer Hara. So Hashem says, but I gave you the Torah as the antidote. That's your secret weapon to protect you against the Yetzer Hara. So now the Zera Shimshon has put together 2 paragraphs of different sources, and he's going to combine all of that now to begin to explain the piece in the Medrash Rabbah that he started with. Uv'chol zeh novo lebeir hamedrash. And with all of this, we can now come to explain the excerpt from the Medrash Rabbah that we started with. Im beirachta es haTorah. The Medrash stated that the Chazal teach us that if a person makes a bracha on the study of Torah, la'atzmecha at mevorech. This means that ultimately they're really making a bracha for themselves. Shekeshe'ata mevorech ala Torah, because when you make the blessing on the Torah, nira sheyesh lecha hana mimena, that indicates that you have spiritual pleasure from studying Torah. And if you are getting the spiritual pleasure, and that's what motivates you to study Torah, top of the next column, who Simon, then it's a sign that you are involving yourself in the study of Torah lishma, for its own benefit, for the appropriate reasons. And when you study the Torah for the appropriate intrinsic reasons, as yeshla, called kocha, then it has all of its capacity, all of its power, lios magna umatzla, to be a protective and saving force for you. And certainly when you study the Torah the appropriate way, it will protect you and save you from the Yetzer Hara. V'hi hatavlin, and it is the antidote. Demo'ilan lamakas hayetzer hara, that the Gemara says is effective against the Yetzer Hara. Ubozeh, and with this, through this, efshar shetavo lidei chet ve'avon, and through this constant study of Torah, for its spiritual pleasure that it brings, and because of its chashivas, as the Zera Shimshon said previously, because of its intrinsic importance, this will certainly make it impossible for a person, while studying Torah in this way, to come to do a sin. And when a person refrains from sinning, tavo lecha hatova, then only good things will come to that person. And so that's what the Medrash Rabbah meant when it said, if you make a bracha on the Torah, that shows you're studying Torah for the right reasons. And when you study Torah for the right reasons, it protects you from the Yetzer Hara. And if you're only doing mitzvos and not averos, then of course you will be rewarded for that, and good things will come to you. So that explains the first part of the Medrash Rabbah quote. Ume'ata ba'mokom l'salkedatach lomar. And from now that we understand this, it comes to us to also be able to understand what was the thought process, so to speak, that the Medrash Rabbah introduced, that perhaps the God giving us the Torah could possibly harm us or do something, have a negative impact on us. Medrash Rabbah said that's something that a person might think. So the Zera Shimshon says now we can understand why that might be something that a person would think. Because the Torah was given, as we said, as we quoted the Gemara, as an antidote to the Yetzer Hara. But that's only, it's necessary for you, and it only applies if you study the Torah lishma. Dafka specifically, but if a person studies Torah not for its intrinsic value and not for the right motivations, then chas v'shalom, God forbid, nasa sam hamabes. We saw from Chazal that it could become a deathly poison for a person. Im kain yoser tov hayolanu. If so, perhaps it would have been better for us. Shelo yiten lanu haTorah. If Hashem had not given us the Torah, ve'az lo hayinu mitzuvim, and then we would not be commanded to keep the mitzvos. Ucheshe'ein tzivoy ein yetzer hara. And as we said before, when there is no commandment to do a mitzvah, then there's no yetzer hara to try and stop you from doing that mitzvah, or to try, if you're not commanded to refrain from a certain act, then there's no yetzer hara to try and prevent you from doing that act. To try and persuade you to do that act. The yetzer hara doesn't get involved in situations in which there's no commandment for the person to either do an act or refrain from doing an act. And even though if this had happened, meaning if the Torah had not been given to the Jewish people, then we would have much less of an opportunity to get sechar, to earn rewards from Hashem for doing the mitzvahs, because we wouldn't have the mitzvahs in the Torah. Lo ichpas klal. Sorry. The God avafal pisha loha yelonu kol kach schar the godol hametzuva v'osim misheino mitzuva. We wouldn't have a chance to get as much reward, because you only get the great reward when you're commanded to do the mitzvah, and you get much more reward than if you're not commanded to do the mitzvah. Lo ichpas klal. This would not matter to us at all. Shahare keneged zeh, because corresponding to this, lo hayolonu nami onesh, we would have no punishment. So it's true that if Bnei Yisrael had never been, Klal Yisrael, Bnei Yisrael had never been given the Torah, then they would have a highly reduced ability to get sechar for doing mitzvos, because they wouldn't be commanded of the 613 mitzvos of the Torah. So we wouldn't get as much sechar, but the Zera Shimshon says, okay, fine, but we would be completely saved from receiving punishments from all the situations in the Torah, from all the mitzvahs in the Torah, where if we do violate the laws, or if we don't do the things we're supposed to do, we can receive an onesh. All of those things wouldn't apply if Klal Yisrael had not been given the Torah. K'di amrinu b'kedushin, as the Gemara says in Maseches Kedushin, and over there that Gemara is talking about a pasuk in Yeshayahu, and we'll see some of the words of that pasuk and what the Gemara says about it in a moment. The Gemara says, Salka data chamina, if you only looked at the first part of that pasuk, you would say, Im tovu, if you wish to do the mitzvos, if you want to do, you have a desire to do the mitzvos, tova, good. Ve'im tima'anu, which is are the next two words in the pasuk, and if you refuse to do the mitzvos in the Torah, lo tova velo ra, that won't be good, you won't get a benefit, but velo ra, and you will not get punished. It won't be bad for you because you won't get punished. The Zera Shimshon says, look over there in that Gemara, and you'll see that the Gemara actually talks about a situation, or at least talks about a pasuk that seems to indicate that there are situations when if a person does a mitzvah, okay, they can get schar. And if they don't do a mitzvah, then they're not going to get punished for not doing the mitzvah. They're not going to receive an onesh. And he says, perhaps that is exactly what the Medrash meant when it said that we might think that giving us the Torah had a negative impact on us, because had he not given us the Torah, we still would have been able to receive some reward for doing the good things in this world, but we wouldn't be able to be punished for all of the mitzvahs in the Torah if we hadn't been commanded. And on this line of reasoning, the Medrash Rabbah answers, Lo nasati ela l'tovaschem. I only gave you the Torah for your benefit. Shemaloche hasharis nisavula, because the malache hasharis, the ministering angels themselves, desired the Torah. Klomar, what does this really mean to say? This idea about the malache hasharis desiring the Torah, what does it really mean to teach us? Ein makom l'svarazu. It means there is no place to accept the reasoning, the line of reasoning which the Zera Shimshon just developed about it being better for the Jewish people not to have received the Torah. Shahare malache asharesh ein lahem yetzer hara, because the malache asharesh have no evil inclination. Ve'afilu hachi, and even so, nisavu law, they desired to have the Torah, even though they didn't have a yetzer hara, and even though they didn't need the Torah study to protect them from the yetzer hara and to protect them from any kind of spiritual punishment. Nonetheless, they still desired to have the Torah. Ve'im isa shehatzivoy gorem leyetzer hara. And if it is that the commandment causes the yetzer hara to come, im hayu gamhe mitzuvim, then that would mean that if the malachim were given the Torah and therefore commanded to do its mitzvos, haya lahem kamochen yetzer hara, then it would mean that then the malachim would have also received the attention, so to speak, of the yetzer hara. Kedichsiv, as a pasuk in Eov says, uv'malachav yasim tahala. And on his angels he places claims. On his angels he places a claim that they weren't acting the way they were supposed to act. He also, so to speak, says that the angels weren't acting 100% correctly. So the Gemara quotes that pasuk in, the Zera Shimshon quotes that pasuk in Eov to say the idea that perhaps even the angels could have a yetzer hara and not perform in every situation appropriately is a possibility that we see from the pasuk in Eov. V'afilu hachi nisavula, and even so they desire to receive the Torah. So the Zera Shimshon is saying, what's the significance of the desire on the part of the ministering angels to receive the Torah? Well, if they could not in any circumstances have a yetzer hara and they still wanted the Torah, that shows that they put the worth of the Torah, so to speak, the value of having the Torah above the protection from the yetzer hara, because they wouldn't need any protection from the yetzer hara. And even if you say that if they did, the angels did receive the Torah, they then would have commandments to follow, in which case they would have the yetzer hara, then even so, even knowing that they would receive the yetzer hara and they would be judged by Hashem if they slipped up in any way, nonetheless, they still wanted the Torah. So in all circumstances, so to speak, mimanavshach, however you slice it, the malachim wanted the Torah and desired it. Shmamino, we see from this, shegodol haschar min hahefsid, that the reward that comes from doing the mitzvahs of the Torah, being commanded and having the mitzvahs in the Torah, is greater than any loss, than any hefsid, any detriment that comes from receiving the mitzvahs of the Torah. Ve'afilu im tirtzu lomar, and even if you want to say she'ein yetzer hara sholei klal b'malachim, that the yetzer hara could never in any circumstances have power over the malachim. Moshe Heshiv lahem Moshe b'perek testa Shabbos, as the Gemara quotes Moshe responding to the malachim in the 9th parak of Masechah Shabbos. Yetzer hara yesh beinechem v'chuli. Do you have a yetzer hara among you that you need to receive the commandments of the Torah to tell you how to act? You have no yetzer hara. Im kain lo yeh lohem nami shum matan schar. If so, that they have the Yetzer Hara has no power over them, then they received in the Malachim, if they had received the Torah, and if they had performed mitzvos, they would receive no schar for overcoming their Yetzer Hara, because they had no Yetzer Hara, according to this line of reasoning. And even so, the Malachim desired strongly to study the Torah and to have the Torah, mishum chashivusa v'hana'asa, because of its intrinsic importance and the spiritual benefit that a being receives from studying it. Mikol shkein, how much more so atem, you, the Jewish people, sheyesh lachem schar harbe, that you certainly do receive tremendous schar, tremendous reward from overcoming your Yetzer Hara and involving yourself in doing the mitzvos and studying Torah. We're going to stop here. The next two paragraphs go on a little bit further into this idea of the malachim and the schar and the onish, etc. But for our purposes, the Zera Shimshon has answered his question and accomplished what he set out to accomplish, in the sense that he has explained what the Medrash Rabbah excerpt meant in terms of the Torah not being hidden from Bnei Yisrael, but being hidden from the Malachim, and the fact that when we make a bracha over the Torah, this shows we're appreciating it correctly, in which case it protects us. And so it's like giving ourselves a bracha when we make a bracha over the Torah, and we study it appropriately for the right reasons. And also we understand the significance of the Malachim desiring to receive the Torah, because this proves how valuable and important it is to have the Torah and the schar for being involved in the Torah, that even the Malachim wanted it. And so alachas kama v'kama kal v'chomer, how much more so should we appreciate the Torah and strive to study it and fulfill its precepts to the best of our ability. Yasher koach to everyone for joining us in the learning tonight, and we look forward, Mirz Hashem, God willing, Be'ezus Hashem, to studying the Zera Shimshon again next week.